September 29th, 2003. 0130 hours. Point Pleasant Park, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The trees began to scream. Not the gentle whisper of wind through leaves, not the rustle of a summer storm, a sustained roar, like standing inside a jet engine. 300-year-old hemlocks, survivors of centuries, witnesses to Halifax's entire modern history, began to crack. Not bend, crack. Greg Shea, Emergency Coordinator for Halifax Regional Municipality, stood in the operations centre watching radar images that shouldn't exist this far north. Hurricane Juan, still Category 2 at landfall, was tearing through the city at 160 kilometers per hour. The eye wall, a perfectly defined circle of destruction, was passing directly over downtown Halifax. "We've got reports of the crane at the construction site," someone said. "It's come down. Not tipped, not damaged, come down." A 200-foot construction crane, designed to withstand everything Atlantic Canada could throw at it, was now lying across Barrington Street like a fallen giant. The forecasts had been clear for days, direct hit. But forecasts are numbers on screens. Reality is the sound of steel twisting, of windows exploding inward, of trees that outlived empires dying in minutes. By dawn, Point Pleasant Park, 96 acres of urban forest, Halifax's emerald crown, had been transformed into a timber graveyard. 75,000 trees down. Not damaged, down. The park looked like a bomb site, like photographs from World War I, all shattered stumps and raw earth where canopy had been. The numbers tell one story. 8 deaths across the region. Power out for 300,000 customers. Damage estimates, $300 million Canadian dollars. One of the most powerful hurricanes to make landfall in Canadian history, matching only the Great Hurricane of 1873. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact of watching your city unmade. Halifax had weathered hurricanes before. The 1873 storm, Hurricane Beth in 1971. But those were history, were stories, were things that happened to other generations. Juan was immediate, visceral, transformative. The cleanup began at first light. Chainsaws, bucket trucks, thousands of volunteers pulling branches from streets, clearing driveways, checking on neighbours. The Canadian military deployed over 1,000 personnel. It was organised chaos, communities binding together through shared trauma. Power restoration took weeks. Some neighbourhoods went dark for 12 days. September turned to October. Leaves that should have been changing. Colours were scattered across highways, torn from trees that no longer existed. The sounds of reconstruction, generators humming, saws buzzing, debris trucks grinding, became Halifax's new soundtrack. By mid-October, a rhythm emerged. Damaged roofs tarped, major roads cleared, power returning block by block. The city was battered but functioning, exhausted but recovering. And then the forecasts started again. February 18th, 2004, 2200 hours. Environment Canada Weather Office, Dartmouth. Meteorologist Chris Fogarty stared at his models and felt dread settling in his stomach. 4 months. They'd had 4 months to recover from Juan, and now this. A Colorado low, a massive winter storm system, was tracking directly toward Halifax. But this wasn't a normal nor'easter. The atmospheric conditions were creating something rare, something historic, a meteorological bomb. "How much snow?" someone asked. Fogarty checked his calculations again. 95 centimetres, maybe more. 95 centimetres, over 3 feet, in less than 24 hours. They named it White Juan, dark humour born of exhausted resilience. If Hurricane Juan had traumatized Halifax, what would this do? February 19th, 2004, 0600 hours. It began as rain, heavy wind-driven rain that soaked everything, that found every crack in those tarped roofs, every gap in hurricane-damaged structures. And then the temperature dropped. The rain turned to snow. Not gentle flakes, not picture postcard winter wonderland. Dense, wet, wind-driven snow falling at rates of 10 centimeters per hour. Visibility dropped to zero. Wind gusts exceeded 100 kilometers per hour. The city disappeared into white chaos. By noon, Halifax was paralyzed. Emergency services couldn't move. Ambulances stuck. Fire trucks immobilized. The city that had spent 4 months cleaning up from one disaster was now completely buried by another. Snowdrifts reached second-story windows. Cars vanished completely, just humps of white along streets you had to remember existed. The storm raged for 18 hours straight. When it finally stopped on February 20th, Halifax lay under 95.5 centimeters of snow, the largest single-day snowfall in the city's recorded history. But the storm had also brought freezing rain, creating a concrete hard crust over everything. Snowplows couldn't cut through it. Shovels bounced off it. There's a moment in disaster response when systems don't just strain, they shatter. Halifax had exhausted its snow removal budget by February 5th, before White Juan even formed. The city owned 44 snowplows. The storm had buried 200 kilometers of streets. Do the math. At best case scenario, clearing would take weeks. But this wasn't best case. This was equipment breaking down from continuous operation. Operators collapsing from exhaustion, nowhere to put the snow even if they could move it. The military deployed again. The Canadian Forces Base Halifax sent every available vehicle, front-end loaders, dump trucks, personnel carriers converted to snow removal. But even military logistics couldn't solve the fundamental problem. There was simply too much snow, and it was too hard. Time equals 3 milliseconds greater than, and there was nowhere to put it. Schools closed for a week. Businesses shuttered. The airport remained shut for 4 days, unprecedented in modern Halifax history. The city essentially ceased functioning, and people began to break. Not riots, not panic. Something quieter and more profound. 4 months earlier, they'd rallied together, chainsawed fallen trees, checked on neighbors, rebuilt with determined optimism. But optimism has limits. Resilience has boundaries. Hurricane Juan had been dramatic, terrifying, but relatively brief. White Juan was grinding, relentless. Time equals 300 milliseconds greater than, / inescapable. You couldn't see out your windows. You couldn't open your doors. You were trapped in your home, in your neighborhood, in this white prison. Emergency room visits for anxiety spiked, calls to crisis hotlines tripled. This wasn't just disaster fatigue. This was a city reaching its psychological breaking point. March came slowly. The snow didn't melt so much as gradually compress, stratify, become part of the urban landscape. Neighborhoods remained cut off for weeks. Some residential streets didn't see a plow until mid-March. But something else emerged through the thaw, a different kind of resilience. Not the initial rally-together spirit of post-Juan cleanup. Something harder, more durable. A recognition that Halifax had endured not one historic disaster but 2, back-to-back, and survived. The insurance claims were processed. The rebuilding continued. Point Pleasant Park remained closed. It would take years to clear the fallen timber, to replant, to restore. Those who visited the devastated park could still see the ghost outline of White Juan in compressed snowbanks that lasted into April. By summer 2004, Halifax looked almost normal. Roofs repaired, power lines reinforced, new trees planted, though they'd take decades, to replace what Juan had destroyed in minutes. The city had developed new emergency protocols, new snow removal strategies, new psychological support systems, but the scars remained. Today, Hurricane Juan and White Juan exist in Halifax's collective memory as a singular traumatic period, the winter that broke the city and forced it to rebuild stronger. Environment Canada still uses both events as benchmark disasters, the kind of 1-in-100-year events that define climate preparedness. Urban planners study Halifax's experience when designing resilient infrastructure. Psychologists examine the compounding effect of sequential disasters on community mental health. And on quiet September nights, tropical storms trek north through the Atlantic. Haligonians still check the forecasts with uneasy recognition. They remember the trees screaming. They remember being buried. They remember what it feels like when nature reminds you that all your infrastructure, all your preparation, all your technology cannot stop what's coming. Hurricane Juan destroyed Halifax in September. White Juan buried it in February. But neither broke it permanently. The city that emerged was different, less certain, more cautious, carrying trauma that still surfaces in storm warnings and winter forecasts, but also more aware of what it can endure, what it can survive. Time equals 3 milliseconds greater than what it means to face disaster and choose to rebuild. Because that's the thing about disasters. They reveal who you are, what you're made of, what happens when everything you thought was permanent proves fragile. Halifax learned it was fragile. Halifax learned it was strong. Both things true at once.